أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وأحيط بثمره ف... وأحيط بثمره فأصبح يقلب كفيه على ما أنفق فيها وهي خاوية على عروشها ويقول يا ليتني لم أشرك بربي أحدا ولم تكن له فئة ينصرونه من دون الله وما كان منتصرا هنالك الولاية لله الحق هو خير ثوابا وخير عقبا واضرب لهم مثل الحياة الدنيا كماء أنزلناه من السماء فاختلط به نبات الأرض فأصبح حشيما تذروه الرياح وكان الله على كل شيء مقتدرا. صدق الله العظيم. The story, which is the second story of Surah Kahf, continues here. Until now, we heard the story began with one of the companions, one of the friends, one of the associates saying that, or he was bragging, in fact, upon his other brother, and he was basically making him feel low, inferior, with his tone and with what he was saying. that أَنَا أَكْثَرُ مِنْكَ مَالًا وَأَعَزُّ نَفَرًا, that I have more wealth than you, am mightier than you when it comes to manpower and so forth. And then we heard the conversation of the second brother, or the second companion, who had not as many means as the first one. And he told him more or less to the effect that, since you see me as being so inferior to you, you should be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it is very possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can take away whatever you have. In short, that's what he was telling him. So from here, that was the warning of the more pious one to the lesser pious one, or the one who had that agnostic belief. As we can hear from his tone, مَا أَظُنُّ أَن تَبِيدَ هَذِهِ أَبَدًا, I don't think this will ever perish. وَمَا أَظُنُّ السَّاعَةَ قَائِمًا, I do not think that the hour will ever happen. And if I were to even return to my Lord, I will find something better than what I have here right now. So this was his ideology, but he was already warned in yesterday's tafsir by his friend that this ideology of yours and this attitude of yours is not suitable. So as I said at the end yesterday, ittaqu firasatil mu'min. Sometimes we should fear the foresight of a mu'min. When a mu'min or a believer tries to guide us in a certain direction, we should take heed of it, because sometimes not taking heed, the consequences could be detrimental for our own selves. So said, so was done. Maybe not immediately, but after time. There's no indication to how long it took. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأُحِيطَ بِثَمَرِهِ فَأَصْبَحَ يُقَلِّبُ كَفَّيْهِ عَلَى مَا أَنْفَقَ فَهِيَ خَاوِيَةٌ عَلَى عُرُوشِهَا وَيَقُولُ يَا لَيْتَنِي لَمْ أُشْرِكْ بِرَبِّي أَحَدًا. That we, or thamarihi, his provisions were surrounded. وَأُحِيطَ بِثَمَرِهِ, and his provisions were surrounded, meaning surrounded by an adab, a torment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You just translate it as some translators do, that his provisions were ruined. فَأَصْبَحَ يُقَلِّبُ كَفَّيْهِ. So he began to, what you can say, turn his palms in and out, putting them on one on top of the other like this. كِنَايَةٌ عَنِ النَّدَمِ وَالْتَحَسُّرِ. This is a hint towards his anxiety and his stress at that time, where he's playing with his hands. We see today too, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows his servants. Some internal dispositions of the human being haven't changed over 1400 years, right? It's the same thing today. When someone's extremely nervous, he starts to, play with his hands. He starts to put his face in his hands. When he's worried, tries to do all type of funny things with his hands when a person is under a lot of stress. So this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. Now, after his provisions were ruined, he started to feel this anxiety عَلَى مَا أَنْفَقَ فِيهَا, upon all that he had spent into this garden. وَهِيَ خَاوِيَةٌ عَلَى أُرُوشِهَا, whilst it had collapsed upon its trestles. Trestles are the frame or the sticks upon which a vine grows, right? That's what you call the trestles. So he saw that everything had fallen over, collapsed, right? وَيُرْسِلَ عَلَيْهَا حُسْبَانًا. His friend was telling him, maybe your Lord might send a torment upon your garden, which I said, Ibn Kathir rahimahullah, he translates or he indicates it to be torrential rain. So when this torrential rain fell, what happened is that all the roots were soggy below and everything started to collapse. So all the date groves, the groves of date palms, all the palms started to fall one on top of the other. Eventually everything started to fall, and also the vines. Some say the date palms themselves fell on the vines. Okay? But everything eventually collapsed. Ala urushiha, on his trestles, meaning the same framework on which the vines grow, they all fell over as well. So everything fell over. Everything was collapsed. So when he saw this situation, that his whole garden now is ruined, وَيَقُولُ يَا لَيْتَنِي لَمْ أُشْرِكْ بِرَبِّي أَحَدًا. He said that only if I did not associate anyone to be a partner to my Lord, which was his provisions, because he didn't believe in any Lord, as we can hear from مَا أَظُنُّ السَّاعَةَ قَائِمَةً. If a person doesn't believe that a day of judgment is coming, he doesn't believe in the Lord. That's one indicates the other, because you only believe in a day of judgment if you believe that there's a Allah that you're going to answer to. And if you don't believe in a day of judgment, that means you don't believe in any Allah anyhow. Okay? There's no Allah that will reckon me. So that was his shirk, that he believed in his provisions. He believed in himself. This was his shirk. So he was saying that only if I was not a mushrik in this manner, that I didn't put all my dependency on my garden and on myself. This was his shirk, as I explained yesterday already. So he felt this nadam, he felt this shame, he felt this regret that everything is ruined and I should have never done shirk in the first place. Some Mufassirin say this is a sign of his tawbah, some say it's not. Whatever the case may be, Allah continues and says, وَلَمْ تَكُنْ لَهُ فِئَةٌ يَنْصُرُونَهُ مِنْ دُونِ اللَّهِ وَمَا كَانَ مُنْتَصِرًا. And he had no manpower who would help him against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَا كَانَ مُنْتَصِرًا, and he himself could not help himself. Right? He had a lot of pride. He had a lot of arrogance. Right? وَعَزُّ نَفَرًا, that I am mightier than you when it comes to manpower. But when this torment and punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came, no one could have stopped it, right? None of his men could have stopped the rain from falling. None of them could have gone and held every tree up, no matter how many men there were. There was no way possible that his mighty group of all his employees could have helped him in this situation. Right? And this is when the adab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes. We see it even today when a hurricane or a tornado or any calamity befalls a place. Man has no power to stop it. When it comes, everyone evacuates and just watches the destruction from a distance, and we try to save as many lives as possible. But to stop it, no one has the power to stop it. Right? There's no might, there's no power, there's nothing can stop the calamity when it befalls a nation. So it says here, he had no manpower that could have helped him against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he himself couldn't help, right? His own self in that situation. He couldn't save himself. He just stood there and watched everything being destroyed. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هُنَالِكَ الْوَلَايَةُ لِلَّهِ لَلْحَقِّ. Okay? That in such times, or in those times, al-walaya here means al-nusra, help, lillahi, belongs to Allah. Al-haq, who is the true God, right? So meaning in such times, if you're going to get help, there's only one place you're going to get help from, right? When the calamity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes, or if a calamity is going to befall a nation, the only place you're going to find help is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No friend, no mother, no father, no sister, no brother, no family, nothing, no employee, no loyal servants, nothing will come into use at such a time. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides to send His punishment, then there's no help besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is the only place you can turn to. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, huwa khayrun thawaban wa khayrun uqba. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is best in terms of reward, and He's best in terms of the outcome. So those who say that he made tawbah, this could also relate to him in a way that Allah is best in reward because he made tawbah, and now whatever lost happened to him in this dunya is very little for the reward which he will receive in the hereafter. And the outcome for him is a very happy ending. Right? He lost everything in this world, but that's a very small price to pay for Iman. If a person has to lose all his worldly assets to understand that Allah is in control of me and I should believe in Allah alone, well, so be it. That's a small price to pay. Because no matter how many worldly possessions a person has, these possessions won't help him on the day of judgment. The only thing is going to help him is his Iman. And then, as we will hear later, al-baqiyatu salihat, whatever good actions he has, that those are everlasting. So if a person has to lose everything, all his materials, just to gain this Iman, well, that's a small price to pay. That's a small sacrifice. So that's the lesson here, was that one should not let his own materials intoxicate him to a point where he forgets Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completely. And this is the current situation of the world, where atheism and also agnostic behavior is on the rise. I think a few years back they said for the first time in history, the percentage of Christians in the UK, I think, has dropped below 50%. That's because many people are not becoming Muslim, they're becoming atheists. They're turning away from Christianity. So there are more now agnostic believers now than even Christians. Okay, Christianity, the percentage of population that are Christian in the UK has now dropped below 50%. So this is the rise because materialism is on the rise. When materialism is on the rise and it becomes a barrier between one and his Lord, he doesn't see a reason to believe in his Lord. But if one reads the Qur'an properly with understanding, it's very easy to understand there is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains it in the Qur'an. So this brings us here now to the end of the fourth section of Surah Kahf. The first section was like a lecture. The second section was the story of the use of the cave. And the third section was a lecture again. And the fourth section was this story of the owner of the garden. Now this fifth section now will begin. وَاضْرِبْ لَهُمْ مَثَلَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا كَمَاءٍ أَنزَلْنَاهُ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ فَاخْتَلَطَ بِهِ نَبَاتُ الْأَرْضِ فَأَصْبَحَ حَشِيمًا تَذْرُوهُ الرِّيَاحُ. This fifth section is again another lecture. So we had a lecture, story, lecture, story, lecture again. Then there will be two stories and then a lecture at the end. And that will make up 8 sections. Okay? So the fifth section is a lecture here beginning again. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, give them and explain to them the example of worldly life is like water which anzalnahu, which we send down minas sama, from the skies. Fakhtalata bihi nabatul ard. The vegetation of the earth is mixed with this water, which means they thrive through this water. Fakhtalata really means for something to mix, to intermingle, mazaja, the two items to mix into one another in such a way that you can't separate one from the next. Like when you mix water into milk, you can no longer see where's the water, where's the milk. It's so like intertwined in there, so mixed, so, you know what I mean? Mixed together that you won't be able to separate it. So that's the meaning of fakhtalata, right? So then the vegetation of the earth is mixed into this water. فَأَصْبَحَ حَشِيمًا تَذْرُوهُ الرِّيَاحُ. And then it becomes dry shaft, which can be scattered تَذْرُوهُ الرِّيَاحُ, by the wind, or which the wind scatters. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, because the people who were opposing him were these materialistic men who thought they had rank, they had status, they had riches, okay, and they didn't want to come to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam's gathering as long as there were poor people around there. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has been told to let them know of this world, explain to them through a parable, through a misal, through an give an example that makes things easier to understand. So tell them, وَاضْرِبْ لَهُمْ مَثَلَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. The parable of the worldly life is like water, which descends, or which we send down. Allah says, which we send down from the skies. And it mixes, and the vegetation mixes into this water, right? And then later, that same vegetation now becomes like a dry husk or a dry shaft. تَذْرُوهُ الرِّيَاحُ, so dry, so weak, so brittle that the wind just takes it away. So what is really being explained here now? Okay. Like Alusi, rahimahullah, and Ruhul Mani, right here, he explains that the example is really is about the worldly life with that of the vegetation which gain nourishment from the water. That when vegetation, this is the actual example, worldly life with the vegetation itself. Okay? That when this vegetation is, what you can say, healthy by means of water, it looks fresh. It looks fresh and appealing. But eventually what happens? It loses its freshness. It dries out when there's no longer water, and it becomes dried out and so brittle that it can be destroyed easily. Just a wind. There's you don't need any man force there to actually pluck it out. It dries up on its own, the wind blows, and it just disintegrates, and it becomes nothing again. So this is the example of the world, right? That the world can change very quickly. In one's youth, everything could be high and daisy, rosy, nice and rosy. but eventually old age will settle in. You'll become brittle and old, and then you will be just like a piece of husk, which can just be blown away at any time. You're just waiting to be disintegrated into the earth very soon, right? But if you notice here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala skips the whole middle section here, right? He says like vegetation with which mixes into the water and then becomes a dry husk. Allah doesn't mention nothing about this vegetation blossoming and becoming beautiful or nothing. So it's like an indication as how short this worldly life will be, right? So it's like the rain fell and it became dry, right? What happened in between? That's the worldly life. It was like a snap of a finger. That's how short your life is. Okay, so Allah didn't even mention that part to indicate that, the shortness of this worldly life. Then Allah says, وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ مُقْتَدِرًا. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is fully capable of everything. He's capable of giving life, and He's capable of sustaining life. He's capable of taking back that life, and He's capable of giving back that life once again on the Day of Judgment. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is fully capable. Allama Qurtubi now, right? he took things to a different level. He says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is actually drawing a similitude between worldly life and water itself. What he says here, Mathala hayati dunya kama'in. It's like water. This worldly life is like water. So do I have the right screenshot here? Let me check. No, that's the wrong one. Look here. So Qurtubi is very eloquent, so I don't even know how I'm going to translate it, but the ulama should, understand this. وَقَالَتِ الْحُكَمَةِ. He says, some wise people say, إِنَّمَا شَبَّهَ تَعَالَى الدُّنْيَا بِالْمَاءِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala drew a similitude between water and the worldly life. لِأَنَّ الْمَاءَ لَا يَسْتَقِرُّ فِي مَوْضَعٍ. Because water doesn't stay in one place. Right? I put some water here, it's going to roll, it's going to move on. كَذَلِكَ الدُّنْيَا لَا تَبْقَى عَلَى وَاحِدٍ. Such is the world. It doesn't stay in one place like that. The world is constantly, it's moving, right? It's moving. That don't need any tafsir, right, boy? Everybody knows the world moving. Right? Then وَلِأَنَّ الْمَاءَ لَا يَسْتَقِيمُ عَلَى حَالَةٍ وَاحِدَةٍ كَذَلِكَ الدُّنْيَا. Also, water doesn't stay in one situation. It doesn't stay in it doesn't remain stagnant. Water is not a stagnant something, right? Again, you know what I mean? Exemplifying how the world is moving. And such is the world also. وَلِأَنَّ الْمَاءَ لَا يَبْقَى وَيَذْهَبْ. And water doesn't remain. It goes away. Right? You put water there, it will evaporate eventually. It won't stay. Eventually, you come back to that water, it will be gone. Okay? كَذَلِكَ الدُّنْيَا تَفْنِي. The world also, it will one day perish, just like how water evaporates and goes away. The world is the same like that. وَلِأَنَّ الْمَاءَ لَا يَقْدِرُ أَحَدٌ أَنْ يَدْخُلَهُ وَلَا يَبْتَلُّ كَذَلِكَ الدُّنْيَا لَا يَسْلَمُ أَحَدٌ دَخَلَهَا مِنْ فِتْنَتِهَا وَآفَاتِهَا. Right? Unlike water, no one can go in water and stay dry and don't get wet. Right? لَا يَبْتَلُّ. You can't enter water, you can't dive in the beach or the sea and come out dry. It's not going to happen. So he says, such is the world, that no one that enters it is basically safeguarded or is protected or finds himself in protection from its fitan and its afat, from its tests and from its trials. Okay, everyone that enters the world must face the trials of the world. Alright? وَلِأَنَّ الْمَاءَ إِذَا كَانَ بِقَدْرٍ كَانَ نَافِعًا مُنْبِتًا وَإِذَا جَاوَزَ الْمِقْدَارَ كَانَ ضَارًا مُهْلِكًا. Alright, and because water, when it's given in its correct proportion, is beneficial and can cause plants to grow. But when you overfeed your plant or overwater it, when you overdo it, right? When you وَإِذَا جَاوَزَ الْمِقْدَارَ كَانَ ضَارًا مُهْلِكًا. That same water can become a means of, or you can say dar, it can be harmful, and it can be muhlik, it can even take your life, right? وكذلك الدنيا القفاف منها ينفع وفضولها يضر. And such is the world also. If you have it in proportionate amount, it can be beneficial. But if you have too much of it, it can also be very harmful. So this was Imam Qurtubi and his writing here. So he says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already here is comparing the dunya to water itself. And the same way water, he says, أَنزَلْنَاهُ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ, that comes down from the skies. Also the ruh, the angels that bring the ruh to the stomach of the mother, where do they come from? From the skies. So we'll stop here, inshallah. Subhanallah.